welcome to Tech Law Talks, a podcast brought to you by Reed Smith's Emerging Technologies Group. In each episode of this podcast, we will discuss cutting-edge issues on technology, data, and the law. We will provide practical observations on a wide variety of technology and data topics to give you quick and actionable tips to address the issues you are dealing with every day.
Welcome to Tech Law Talks and our new series on artificial intelligence. Over the coming months, we'll explore the key challenges and opportunities within the rapidly evolving AI landscape. Today, we will focus on AI in the interesting world of esports, and we have together with us today Mr. Paul Foster, who is the CEO of the Global Esports Federation. Good morning, Paul.
Good evening, Bryan. It's nice to be with you, coming to you from California.
And I'm coming to you from Singapore, but we are all connected in one world. Today, we are here to talk about AI and esports. But before we start, I wanted to talk about you and to share what you were doing before AI and how that has changed after AI has now become a big thing.
Thanks, Bryan. Yeah. So I come originally from Sydney, Australia, and my background is really 20 years in the Olympic movement. So I started at the Sydney 2000 Olympics. So I started about 3 years before the Olympics and worked for the Olympics for about 20 years. So traditional sports, and then moved to esports and opened or founded the Global Esports Federation in 2019. And of course, we all know what happened 4 months after that, Bryan, with COVID and the pandemic that really closed a lot of traditional sport. And so esports really took off. So it's definitely been a very, very exciting and accelerating journey these last couple of years.
Great. So you've kind of gotten into esports after a background in sports. And it's interesting you mentioned 2019, because we also know that somewhere around 2022, the end of 2022, just as the pandemic was sorting itself out, artificial intelligence, primarily generative artificial intelligence, then began to capture the imagination of people. And the question here, I guess, is maybe we're talking to converted, but esports is obviously one of the most technologically advanced and clued in online ecosystems, communities. How has artificial intelligence impacted esports, and is that a positive or a negative thing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bryan. I think one of the things that I like to say is that we're living in what I consider to be one of the most exciting times in the history of humanity. And the reason I say that is because of the convergence of all these incredibly powerful technologies at exactly the same time, at the very early dawn of AI. And I think it's something that we should reflect on, because I think many people talk about AI as if we're already in the middle of the cycle. And I think my position is that we're at the very early dawn, maybe even the pre-dawn of AI. I did some postgraduate studies in machine learning and AI. So it's a passion project of mine. It's something I love to think about. And I was recently at the Global Summit on AI with the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, and had a chance to sit with the leaders group. There was 30,000 people attending, Bryan, which is a big number of people showing the interest from all over the world. But there was a leaders group convened to look at policy making. And in a sense, there was this feeling that industry has been rapidly growing and expanding, almost at a pace or a cadence that is hard to sort of register in a sense. And then policymakers, and particularly governments and others, are trying to sort of catch up in a sense and try to get in front of that. As you know, Bryan, we're very strong partners with UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organization, as well as the International Telecommunications Union. So we're also contributing to their thinking and bringing our community into the discussion. One of the things that could be interesting for our listeners is that it's true what Bryan said, is that our community, which is roughly in the range of 18 to 34-year-olds, are early adopters of technology. And one of the things that might be interesting is that gamers and people who play electronic sports and games have always been exposed to artificial intelligence in some form, even very, very early form. And so it's not a surprise to me that the adoption of artificial intelligence and the interest in artificial intelligence in some ways has been really accepted by the esports community and the gaming community. And as you also said, Bryan, this demographic, 18 to 34, is really the heart of what we call Gen Z or Gen. And then now we're seeing Gen Alpha, of course, the next generation starting high school. But what we also call this, and some people widely call this generation, is actually Gen T, generation around technologies, and the early acceptance of that. And I can talk a little bit more about some of the applications for esports if that's interesting.
No, I think that's interesting. And I think in particular, I think what will be interesting to hear is some of your own visions about what the future of AI and esports could be like. What does it promise to the esports community? What can they kind of look forward to? What, how do you see that going?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it's, again, I think there's the possibilities are limitless, and we're really at the beginning, the early time about this. And when I speak, for example, recently to colleagues and friends at companies such as OpenAI and others that I speak to every day, there's a true interest around this, particularly around the creative economy and how we'll create games in the future. And there's three things, Bryan, that I thought I'd mention, which is really the use of AI in terms of teams and players' preparation, the fact that we can have quicker and more efficient. I call it, one of the great benefits, one of the things I've learned in my studies is that it needs to be human focused and human centric. And we're also at the Global Esports Federation, we support the UNESCO's position on the creation of ethical AI. And what that really talks about is human focused and human centered. And so one of the things I think is really interesting for our community is that they'll have quicker access to statistics, to analytics, to data. So they'll be able to, if you think about esports as a competitive sport or as a competitive event, any preparation that you can have to prepare you to have better results and better preparation should ultimately provide for a better outcome for you as a competitor, right? So that's number one. The second thing is that really what we can do for the creative economy, which is absolutely fascinating, Bryan, in esports, the whole economy around, or the whole community around creators and content creators and people that really bring esports and bring it alive, is that we'll be able to have automatically created clips and reels and analytics. So in real time, things like in pre-AI, we would have had to wait for editing, Bryan. We would have had to wait for editing. It might have taken hours or days. And now that can happen in seconds. So so that's fascinating. And then the third thing, so team preparation, creative economy. And then the third thing really talks around the economics of gaming and around sponsorship and value-based identity. So that in the future, our sponsors and our partners that are so important for the thriving nation and the sustainability of gaming and esports will also be able to use AI to have greater analytics and greater awareness of their brand values, to actually understand the value of their brand. So a very simple example is we can use AI to track how many times a certain brand was visible on a jersey or in an audience. We'll be able to use AI to actually track it in real time. Whereas again, Bryan, in the past, we would have had to look through video files and actually count it manually. And I remember doing that. I mean, another example I'll give you is I remember not that long ago in my work at the Olympic Games, I literally remember installing what we used to call video walls. So walls of not even a video screen, but 12 video screens, or 16, I think they were, 4x4 screens to be able to look at every venue at once. And when I think about that now, that seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't a long time ago. I mean, within the last 10 or 12 years, that was still our reality. And now we can use AI to capture that data to give us the same results in real time across teams, across creators, and across partners.
Okay, thank you for that. I think three very concrete areas that we can look forward to as an esports community. Interestingly, you also mentioned the regulators, the governments trying to keep in touch with the development of AI, and it sounded as if it was a bit of a struggle for them. Do you think there are any big concerns about the deployment of AI in esports that we should be kind of aware of and maybe try to avoid?
Yeah, I think it's really this notion about catching up, right? Like, how do you catch up with something that's evolving every day and every hour of every day at a speed that's really difficult to contain, and also two schools of thought, really, which is one school of thought, which I remember, Bryan, I think Sam Altman from OpenAI recently said it. And he said, look, we're so busy and this is running so fast and so powerful, we'll come back and we'll get back to that later. Like we're off, creating these incredibly strong and powerful platforms. We'll have to come back to those matters at a later stage. And it was interesting because when I was last couple of weeks ago in Geneva, you had policymakers, governments, ministers, and et cetera, whose role was to make sure that the frameworks were established around implementing the framework on ethical AI, were really struggling with this reality of being able to literally physically struggling with this reality of trying to get ahead of the knowledge, not only the knowledge, but also the policy work that needed to be put in place, the frameworks, the regulations, and then rolling that out across industry. At the same time, you have technology firms, and particularly firms with specialization in AI, and you've seen the incredible value chain skyrocketing in recent months, really racing ahead. And yet you've got policymakers trying to get their hands around this and trying to even understand it. That you've got the same challenges in academia, don't you, Bryan, with academia also trying to create curricula that by the time it's published, we may already be behind the 8 ball in terms of where AI has taken us. So I think the thing that I would talk about is the concern I would have is the ethical side of AI because, and keeping it human focused and in the best interest of humanity, meaning that really what the benefits are, the focus of benefits should be around making our lives more efficient, effective, and more equitable. And there is a risk, of course, within AI that it can, because of prejudice that is potentially built into the AI itself, that it could continue to manifest that across the community. And that's something that's difficult to get ahead of unless it's created with that lens at the very beginning.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. It's a good reminder that this is technology we're dealing with, and technology can be something that's used for the good of humanity, but it can also be abused. And we have to keep in mind that the technology is there only for the benefit of mankind, like you said, and to keep that human centricity always in focus as AI is applied to esports. Okay, so
That's
last
good.
question, I promise you, Paul. As CEO of Global Esports Federation, what would you wish for the future of esports? And maybe just to make it interesting, on two spectrums, one, a more realistic expectation, and the second one, a moonshot. If your wish can be granted, what would your wish for esports be?
What a great question. Thanks, Bryan. I love that opportunity. Well, the thing that's so interesting in esports and gaming is that anything that was a moonshot about 2 weeks ago is now already a reality. It moves so fast. So when you were mentioning a moonshot, so I was thinking about the Olympics, and I'll talk about that in a moment because that would have been considered a moonshot just a few months ago, if not years ago. So, but what I think the future is the globalization of esports as a source of incredibly inclusive, powerful, evocative entertainment, right? So just as you have traditional sport, and just as you have, for example, in the United States, you have the proliferation of leagues and professional sports, it's coming into view that you'll have very significant value and be able to really create a very sustainable living as an economic means through esports, not only as a player winning significant prize money, but also as a content creator, as a game developer, as a marketeer, as an event organizer, as an academic. There's tons of opportunities. And in fact, Bryan, I was speaking with some friends of mine who are attorneys actually, and it surprises me because traditionally I would talk to attorneys and then through conversation it comes out that they're really passionate about gaming. And now maybe they specialize around being with their legal expertise in terms of intellectual property rights or different aspects of it. And this also, I wanted to share that with you, Bryan, because I thought that was interesting that even in a traditional professional such as the practice of law, there's now a lot of interest in this field as well. What does that mean? That means that we get to manifest our lives how we wish them to be manifested. In the past, If I wanted to go into event management, I would have to do a certain angle. Now I can do that with inside esports. If I wanted to be in communications and global media, I might have had to do that in public relations or in traditional luxury goods, for example, or consumer products. Now I can do it inside esports. So I think the future is extremely bright and relatively limitless in terms of being able to manifest my career, finding something I want to do in my profession, my skills, but be able to do it in something that I love doing. And that's a blessing, I think, Bryan, that very few of us for you and I, that has happened in our lifetime, that we're able to actually have the life that we want, create the professional conditions we want, earn a living at that by doing it in a field that we love. The moonshot, which you've challenged me on, is I was so proud, having come from the Olympic movement in my hometown of Sydney and now seeing the reality of the Olympic Esports Games, which was just announced by the IOC a couple of weeks ago and then rapidly evolving. And how interesting is this? At the Paris 2024 Olympic Games, it seems that we'll see an announcement of the Olympic Esports Games itself, agreed by the IOC, confirmed by the IOC. And so one of the things that I think is fascinating, if you think about Olympic sport, traditional sport, it took golf 121 years to come back onto the Olympic program. And esports in Global Esports Federation was, as you said, Bryan, founded in 2019. Here we are just 4 years later. Not only is it inside the Olympic movement, but there's actually a separate IP created called Olympic Esports Games. If we think about that for a moment, the IOC traditionally had their Olympic Games as their main IP. Yes, Winter Games. Yes, Youth Games. But now we have the Olympic Esports Games as a separate IP. And what's even interesting at the recent press release I read is that it said a whole new division, a whole new structure will be created at the IOC. Rather than trying to fit it into traditional models, a whole new structure will be created. So this was a moonshot, and I think that this will be fascinating in terms of how we see that evolve and how you see a traditional sports organization just a couple of years ago really being a long way away from today. And in those very short years with the Global Esports Federation staging our Commonwealth Esports Championships, the European Esports Championships, the Pan American Esports Championships, and now seeing the evolution at the Olympic Esports Games. What an incredible opportunity that is for athletes, creators, and community right around the world.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a great statement to make, that what was yesterday's moonshot is today's reality in a fast-paced world that evolves because of technology. Thank you again for sharing with us your thoughts, Paul. I think it's been greatly exciting. We look forward to a great future in esports. And once again, thank you for joining us in this series.
Thank you, Bryan. Thanks very much, everyone.
Tech Law Talks is a Reed Smith production. Our producers are Ali McCardle and Shannon Ryan. For more information about Reed Smith's emerging technologies practice, please email techlawtalks@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts. This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.